This is Software Engineering Radio, the podcast for professional developers on the web at se-radio.net. SE Radio is brought to you by the IEEE Computer Society and by IEEE Software Magazine. Online at computer.org/software.
Hi all, welcome to Software Engineering Radio. This is your host, Kanchan Shringi. Our guest today is Chase Kocher. Chase is the founder and CEO of Aim for Hire, a technology recruitment agency that partners with tech startups in Austin, Texas. Chase founded his company when he realized that startup companies need a different approach for sourcing and recruiting for the competitive market. Welcome, Chase. Really looking forward to our conversation today, where I would love to explore the recruiting lifecycle from the candidate, the company, and the recruiter's point of view. Is there anything else you'd like to add to your bio before we get started?
No, that was fantastic, and very excited to have the discussion from all sides of the recruiting lifecycle with you.
So in the show notes, I've added a related episode that we did on this topic 5 years ago. So my first question to you is, has anything significant changed in the recruiting lifecycle in the last 5 years? And why is there still a need for recruiting firms?
Yeah, so over the course, obviously, the last 5 years and with kind of COVID intervening and part of that, I think there's certainly a major digitalization or utilization of different software tools and technical advancements around recruiting, around finding jobs, around interviewing and getting jobs. I think you'd find probably that a lot of the larger companies are utilizing things that can save them time, save them resources. So whether that be systems that when you apply for a job, it helps filter through who might be the best applicant for that job. On LinkedIn, there's algorithms set up that will actually try to match you with the right job or the right company that might be applicable to you based on your background or based on certain nuances of companies or skills that you have. So I think in the last 5 years, like really to summarize, the integration of before recruiting was very transactional, is very a resume, is very a lot of phone screens and personal interaction. Whereas now, technologies continue to kind of advance and find ways to maybe make that process more efficient. Sometimes there probably are deficiencies with software, as we all know. It's not always perfect. Sometimes you might you might not get the interview that you think you deserve, and it might not even be your fault. There might be an algorithm that somehow kind of deleted you from the process. But with that said, those are the advancements that are occurring that, I think 5 years ago we would have never really thought about. Whereas now, we have screen recordings, we have video interviews, we have all different types of kind of filters to use, whether we're recruiting on LinkedIn, whether we're recruiting through resumes on Indeed or Dice. It's just a lot of advancement that I think enables a better scope for recruiters to find talent and hopefully for talent to find opportunities. So overall, that's kind of how I would cover the 5-year advancement for recruiting.
With all the advancement in algorithms, why do we need recruiters?
I guess I failed to answer that part. So recruiters, the thing that any recruiter would probably argue is that, with an AI platform or with an AI software application, you can teach intelligence. Can you teach consciousness? Can you teach that human decision making? And I don't know if there's a right or wrong answer, but in our minds, in my mind as a recruiter, there is a personal relationship development that is created, that does happen in this world. And that if people are looking for a job, that they often want to speak with maybe a human being versus a computerized voice or a computer of some kind where they're just inputting data. Other times, sometimes it's hard to put into words what you do or why you feel like you might be a great person for that role. You can't just type up a little paragraph describing why you're the perfect fit. You'd rather be able to have the personal relationship, personal connection, mutual interest besides just the job that you're applying for. But what recruiters bring to the table is that they do this full time. They spend not 24 hours, but 40 hours a week connecting with prospective talent, but also speaking with companies that are hiring. They'd end up developing kind of a network, a spider web of connections that, if I'm a company and I'm looking to hire, or if I'm a recruit trying to find a job, I want to go to someone that's well connected that can get me in front of a hiring manager at a company that I didn't know about, but might be a great fit for me, or, various other reasons. So I think recruiters, for one, it's the network they develop, but two, it's that they can be advantageous to a recruit just by helping them with their resume, helping kind of guide them through the interview process. And then at the end, which has become even more of a bigger thing, is kind of help with the negotiation to where, if the recruit is seeking a certain amount of money or a certain salary or whatever that might be, and maybe they're afraid to bring that up, or they don't want the confrontation to come up with the company, they can use the recruiter kind of as the middle person to hopefully navigate and get the best result. So I'd say, I could talk for hours about how I think recruiters are important, but I think those are two of the areas that are just going to be hard for software to replicate. But, we're certainly seeing more and more of it. So, who knows?
That makes clear on what recruiting firms provide to the hiring company. What about the candidate?
Yes. From a candidate's perspective, I think you must understand that recruiters are in the know. I mean, their job is to be in contact with people that are hiring all the time. So I think from a candidate perspective, it's a great resource to connect with recruiters just to be on their radar for potential positions that might come up. With that said, the one thing to keep in mind is the recruiters do often get paid if you take the job that they get them, or that they get you, or they get you positioned for. So sometimes there's a slight bias there towards they might steer you in a direction that might be favorable to both of you. And that's just something to keep in mind contextually. But the connections that a recruiter would have, it's certainly something I would always suggest kind of trying to build those relationships. It'll give you more opportunities and more jobs that maybe you weren't aware of just from job boards or other types of things.
What was the gap you observed that led you to start your own firm?
Yes, I think there's a very, like any industry, there's this kind of cookie cutter volume type of recruitment where it isn't very personalized. It's not very customized to a recruiter or to a recruit or to the company that you're recruiting on behalf of. It's kind of more of a broad brush of we do it this way and we're going to do it for every company we work with. So for us, especially being in Austin, Texas, which is a huge tech startup community, I just identified a way to be a bit more boutique, a bit more specialized. And in a market like this where the demand's so high, the mass messaging outreach to recruits doesn't cut it anymore for that type of talent. It takes someone that full time is investing their time in establishing relationships, getting in front of candidates and telling them about companies. And then on the flip side, representing those candidates when those candidates have 4 or 5 other interview processes going on. So it can be a lot to juggle. It's certainly a full-time job. So that's really where I identified just being a bit more specialized in the way you go about doing the recruitment cycle.
Let's now talk about the steps of the recruiting life cycle.
The steps of the recruiting life cycle, from a recruiter's perspective, it's from a company's perspective, it is you are looking at sourcing. That's the top of the funnel when it comes to prospecting for candidates. So sourcing can be a lot of using LinkedIn, job boards, other types of things to develop a pipeline of talent. And then from there, there's outreach, there's getting a hold of those people, which can be unique. And if it's on Facebook, if it's on email, if it's via LinkedIn, but doing your best to get in front of those people. And then from there, it's usually a screening of some kind, letting them know about the companies they represent and the positions that recruiter might have for them. From a candidate's perspective, it's a lot of positioning yourself to be sourced, to kind of fall within that recruiting life cycle of a recruiter, obviously to get seen and to get potentially more opportunities at looking at jobs.
Building the talent pool. My question to you is, how do you ensure that this pool is diverse?
Yes, I think you got to look at where your applicants are coming from. If you're a company that's hiring and looking to diversify your pool of candidates, posting that job in different places aside from just your website can ensure that you at least get a diverse pool, at least from different job sites. And kind of maybe some folks tend to use certain job sites versus others. So I think that helps diversify your pool, but also distributing your job amongst organizations in town, amongst kind of community groups. If there's a Java group or there's a Ruby on Rails group, I think that it helps you as a hiring manager, as a company, develop kind of a unique, different avenues of talent that can apply to your job. So to make sure you're not missing out on certain pockets of talent or certain communities that might be a great fit and a great addition to your company. So I think it's visibility, but also I think it's proactively kind of going out and finding ways to search different groups in town, different universities that people come from and colleges that they got education from. I think that kind of helps you ensure that you're getting all different types of talent to potentially come to your company. And also for female engineers and African American engineers, like there's different ways to go to those organizations, go to those user groups and make sure that they have your information as a company. They're sharing your jobs to their communities. Like those are different ways you can kind of go and try to make sure that you're giving everyone an opportunity to know that you're hiring and generate a diverse pipeline of talent.
Let's now just start with the positions that startup companies begin, since you're focused on startups. So what positions do they hire to begin with? Is it the gamut of product development, management, SRE, engineering management, or do they start with some specific positions?
Yes, I would say, depending on, obviously when a startup begins, there's a couple founders, and sometimes one of those founders might have product skills or engineering skills. But ultimately for tech startups, it's having someone in product and someone to lead like the software engineering technical part. I think those are really the two kind of boxes that must be checked to develop an MVP type product that you can take to market. And then you can bring sales, marketing, those types of things. Now, some companies do it in reverse. It's hard to sell a product if it's not created, but I think some companies maybe try to do that. But I would certainly say that the vast majority start with product leadership and then engineering management, engineering VP type positions. And then from there, like, SRE and DevOps type talent certainly becomes integrated as one of the first couple hires as that company begins to scale and the infrastructure becomes essential once they kind of start onboarding big customers or a multitude of customers.
What about DevOps? How has the move to DevOps changed things? How have they changed the expectation and landscape for prod dev positions?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so DevOps is one of those things where I think a lot of people might say they're a DevOps engineer, but maybe they gravitate a bit towards back end development or they gravitate a bit more towards like system administration type work. I think the emergence of the DevOps term is always one that kind of just determining exactly how much time they'll be spending on either, what areas will they be working most in. I know site reliability certainly has become a major focus, and with a lot of the companies hosting in different cloud services, it's microservice architectures. It just gives a greater emphasis on those types of hires. And having a multifaceted DevOps SRE engineer is a huge strength for a lot of companies if you can find the right people. So I would say it's certainly shifted things, but I think there's folks that tend to have like a bit more dev, less ops, or a bit more ops, less dev. So that's just something to be aware of when you're hiring or recruiting for that type of talent.
One last question in the intro section, and then we'll start talking about things from the viewpoint of the candidate. The recent forced remote work due to COVID, I suppose you've seen a lot of changes due to that. Can you comment?
Yes, I can comment for sure. The remote work is, I think, from a recruiting perspective, is going to be one of the biggest questions you have to answer to candidates for the foreseeable future. So many candidates we speak with now, won't even take a phone call unless the role is fully remote for foreseeable future, and that there's a flexible approach by that company of like they won't ever require you to come into the office, in 6 months or a year from now, and changing that. Now, it's difficult for companies to make promises that far ahead in a world that's changing as dramatically and quickly as ours does. But I think remote work in general is certainly something that's real, and we need to take very seriously in acquiring and recruiting for talent. They want flexibility. Candidates in general might be open to going to an office, but they want to hear from the beginning that there is a flexible and agile approach moving forward, and that they won't be forced to come to the office 5 days a week again. I think COVID has just caused that shift. And for certain talent pools with as much demand as there is, companies have to kind of flex around those requirements or that leverage that candidates have. So, and, some smaller companies, it was an easy transition to be fully remote as they're, it's a lot easier to manage a team of 2 or 3 people fully remote on video calls. But if you have a team of 20, 30, 40 people, it certainly, if you're not set up with the infrastructure, that's a very difficult transition, and a transition that a lot of companies, I think, are still trying to really kind of own and finalize and specialize the way they do that. So I think it actually helped a lot of smaller companies in some ways because they were already agile and they could pivot quickly. The bigger companies are the ones I think that will continue to have to kind of tussle with that and figure out a way to accommodate the talent pool that wants to be remote.
Thanks for that, Chase. Now let's start talking about this flow from the viewpoint of the candidate. Let's say I'm just out of school. How do I approach the job market? What tools should I be familiar with? What should I start focusing on?
So fresh out of school, I think it's intimidating for anyone that's looking for their first job. So I would say utilizing tools that give you visibility to prospective companies, to recruiters, is a way that can generate an inbound flow of people reaching out to you versus you having to chase down companies. So just out of school, I think preparing a general LinkedIn profile is always step one in my mind, because so much recruitment these days occurs on LinkedIn and LinkedIn Recruiter. So just creating a general profile that I think either has your resume attached to it, or you kind of autofill some of your sections in LinkedIn with what your resume would show. I think just keeping in mind that a lot of recruiters utilize LinkedIn to search for talent. So you want to best kind of represent yourself on your LinkedIn profile with keywords. Maybe if you're a software engineer, tech stacks, certain languages that you have experience with. If you're a salesperson, maybe just talking a bit more about some percentages or some statistics that you can share from your internships or experience in college. From there, I think Indeed, Dice, some of these job boards that you can just post your resume to, I think you have to do that as well. I mean, you want to have as many irons in the fire as possible, but I would always say LinkedIn is a number one for me. And then following that, submitting your resume to local and national job boards, just going to give you more visibility to companies that are looking to hire.
Does that change if I'm someone with 3 or 4 years of experience?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And what I would suggest to that fresh out as well is on LinkedIn, you can search through alumni of your current university or college or community college. I mean, coding camp. I think you can use LinkedIn to search familiarities with maybe someone that is similar to you that's a year or two older, and you can potentially connect with them and they might have suggestions. So that would be the end of that last question. As far as the 3 to 4 years out of grad school, I would say network, network, network. Like, think of people that you've studied with, that you've worked with, that you felt like-minded, that you felt like you had a similar maybe career trajectory, or you enjoyed working with that personality type. Reach out to those people, look at people you've worked with in the past and see where they're working now. One of the easiest ways to get positions, get hired, I mean, the top way of hiring for a lot of companies is referrals. So if I work at the company and I refer someone, like, they already are starting at a higher percentage of getting that job than someone that would be a non-referral and maybe no one really knows aside from them applying for a job. So I would say network, look at people that you've worked with that have been managers before, and ask them about, the companies they're at, opportunities they're hearing about. And then secondarily, I think LinkedIn, Indeed, job boards, you certainly want to have that covered as well. But I'd be a little more proactive and using the network you've established over the last 3 or 4 years to kind of find some opportunities that might align with what you're looking for.
That makes a lot of sense. It's always easier to get hired, or it's always easier to hire when you know somebody in the past.
Absolutely.
How many companies would I expect to interview with typically?
Depending, if you're in product or tech, I would say what we've seen is a lot of probably 5 companies at a time. There's so much demand for tech and product talent that I think you'll see you could rack that up. I've seen some people interviewing for 7 or 8 companies at a time. On the flip side, for different skill sets, it might be closer to 3 or 4 companies. But either way, there's so much demand in the market that I think you want to keep your options open. You want to be in a position of power and leverage once you get to the offer stages with the company. So I think, I don't know if I have a suggestion per se, but what we've seen is typically anywhere from 3 to 7 or 8 companies at a time you're interviewing with. But it becomes a full-time job from that point because you're conducting so many interviews with each of those companies. So you got to be committed to the cause, and also your current job might falter very noticeably once you start interviewing with that many companies.
And that's true because there are multiple steps when you interview. What are they?
Yes, I think companies have become a bit more cued into to speeding up that process and trying to accommodate a candidate, but that's a generalized statement. There are some companies that still have 8, 9 interview steps. I always suggest what I've seen a lot of companies shifting to is a closer to a 4-step process that would include kind of an intro call with the HR department, which would be a bit more broad cultural type assessment. They share more about the company. Then you dig into the, call with the hiring manager, a panel interview with the different team members on that team that you're interviewing for. And then the final stage is often maybe an executive level who's really half interviewing you and asking you questions, but really is trying to get you bought into what they're doing and see if you might be a good addition to that cause that they're trying to kind of chase. So I would say 4 steps is closer to what we see these days. But in the past, the bureaucratic companies, they tend to have 8, 9, 10 interviews. So I think understand your customer or the company you're interviewing with, and ask early on, what are those stages? How many stages are there? I think being aware of that is certainly a key move for recruits.
What should I expect from the recruiter? As you mentioned earlier, referrals, it's better if you're part of a referral, that there's somebody lobbying for you and making sure your resume is considered. If it's not that, how do you even know that your resume is being read?
Yes, I think that's the greatest fear when you go and apply to a job online. When you submit your resume, is did my info ever get reviewed? And if it did get reviewed, did it get reviewed by like an HR person or by a subject matter expert or the hiring manager? I think that's a huge, I guess, issue and problem with the whole process, is that as a recruit, sometimes you aren't going to get those answers. I mean, actually, more often than not, you're probably not going to get those answers. So I think using a recruiter can often help you kind of maybe get a little more intel as to why they liked you or didn't like your profile, and things you can do differently. These recruiters, again, see this on a daily basis, so they often can provide some suggestions that might better position you for the next job that comes or the next opportunity. But overall, I would say don't expect a lot of feedback. That's just kind of the market we're in. It's unfortunate, but I would just do your best to be keen on any details you can find out when you do get a response that says we're not interested. Maybe digging around and trying to ask and see if you can get any more intel as to why.
Yeah, it's certainly about the feedback, but it's also about making sure that you are getting traction with that company. So yeah, I do appreciate that's a challenge, and that's why I asked you about it. But let's say resume is read, you get contacted. How do you know what to prepare for, and how long should you expect to prepare?
Yes. Again, I think knowing your audience, like, if you're going to be speaking with a recruiter, then maybe just surface level, reading about the company or the opportunity that you applied for. I think if you're interviewing with a hiring manager or someone that is a subject matter expert in a different area, I think preparing accordingly. So this is how you can use LinkedIn and search that person's name. For example, if all you have is their name and their title, looking on LinkedIn, look at their LinkedIn page, see where they went to college, see what they do, if they have any description of what their current job is. Look at their career trajectory and how they got to that position. You want to have as many talking points as possible to avoid those awkward silences in a first call. That first call is like a first date. It's like you want to be prepared for the worst and hope for the best. And so I would say, in that first step, usually it's a very surface level phone call or video call just to kind of run through your resume, and they'll ask to kind of hear about your journey. And maybe they'll tell you a little bit more about the company that they're at and the job. But I would be overly prepared for those types of interviews so you can set yourself apart from everyone else that's doing the exact same thing in that first interview step, which is just walking through their resume, and that's the extent of it.
So this was the first interview. It's typically the screen, and you mentioned it could be over the phone or even over video. And let's say you do okay, and then there is the detailed set of interviews. You did give us a hint of how many to typically expect, but can you talk a little bit more about what tools the candidate should be familiar with? How much time they should set aside? Is it typically a whole day, a couple of days, or spread over several days?
Yes, depending on the size of the company you're interviewing with, I think that varies things quite a bit. But I would say for that second step, you're usually looking at an hour long commitment, whether it be on the phone or video. And then that third step, which tends to be like the on site interview, if it's virtual or if it's actually on site, like that's usually a half day or a full day of interview engagement. So I would be prepared for what they call the on site interview, which usually includes interviewing with multiple managers or multiple stakeholders in different areas of the company. And that can often take at least half a day, if not a full day. So that's the biggest part of the interview process. That's the most time consuming, in my opinion, is usually you're looking at 30 to 45-minute kind of calls, but the on site stage or that third interview is often the longest.
And do companies typically share who the people interviewing would be so you can do a little bit of the prep that you mentioned earlier?
Ask them, ask them, ask them. Like sometimes they don't. In fact, maybe most of the time they don't. And that's just because they have so many candidates in play. They might be sending the same message out to each recruit. So I think, always ask, be thoughtful in how many questions you ask, be concise. But I would say, ask questions before you're going to invest an hour or 2 hours of your time to know who you're meeting with and if there's any agenda or if there's any specific topics that you should expect to come up. Now, using a recruiter, sometimes the recruiter knows those things and they can give you a little bit of prep on what to expect. But if you don't have a recruiter or that person's not as communicative, then I would always say just ask for as much detail as you can and then go research the people you're going to meet with. If there's a certain topic they want to discuss, go read about why the company is doing so well or why it was named to the Inc. 5000 list. Like, I think research and be prepared for these interviews is going to position you best to get that job and make a great impression with those people.
What are the basic tools to be familiar with? Drawing tools, CoderPad like tools. Can you give some examples?
Yes. Gosh. Yeah, there's so many different, I think, coding kind of places where sandboxes and different things that you can actually kind of practice in, or that a company might even require you to conduct some type of coding challenge within. I haven't seen necessarily some broad, like everyone uses this one tool. So I would say really focus on your GitHub account as a software engineer and having that updated as much as you can. I understand that some of that information is proprietary, you cannot share it, but I think having a GitHub account really enables you to share that obviously with a prospective company, and they can look through some of your code samples and different projects that you've done. That way, like if you're in a technical interview or you're in a coder rank test, whatever it is, it's a little less pressure. If you make a mistake or two, you can always point to, well, GitHub, where I had time and someone wasn't looking over my shoulder, I was able to do this type of work. But the coding challenges and tests are difficult, and there's not really a broad, everybody uses the same ones per se. So I think doing your best to have a GitHub account is a good backup plan to point to and maybe share that kind of info with the hiring manager either before or after that interview.
Are candidates typically given time to ask questions either at the beginning or at the end? And what kind of questions do you suggest in general people should ask?
Yeah, I mean, I think generally they have the opportunity to maybe ask questions at the end of an interview. But if your interview already went 15 minutes past what it was supposed to, the last thing a candidate feels like doing is asking questions and holding that hiring manager or that person from getting back to their job. So I would certainly email prior to the interview maybe a couple questions that you'd like to discuss, or ones that you'd prefer to get answered before the end of the interview, that can kind of ensure that the hiring manager is aware of that those are questions you want answered prior to moving to the next step. But I think more often than not, you end up running out of time and maybe you ask one question or two at the end. So as far as those questions go, I think, depending on the position, maybe it's just understanding what are the expectations of this role? What is the asking about work-life balance can sometimes be a red flag to companies. So I would keep that in mind. Now, I'm not saying that's fair, but companies are hiring you to do a job. So if you're asking questions about all of the things that include not working, that it might be a little bit more of a turnoff than if you're asking about what does it take to become a lead engineer at this company. If you're a junior or mid-level, like how can I work my way into more responsibilities? I think asking those questions or asking for examples of someone that's moved up within the company, that's always something hiring managers like to hear because they're obviously wanting to hire A players that are committed and wanting to move up within the company. So I think asking strategic questions like that, as well as if you have questions about just how bonuses work or how incentives work, I think those are questions I'd suggest versus asking about the benefits and work-life balance. Like go through the HR recruiter interviews asking those questions. When it gets to a hiring manager, ask them about things that they deal with on a daily basis. What's your greatest challenge, Mr. Hiring Manager, Mrs. Hiring Manager, that you're trying to accomplish this quarter? And how is this hire going to impact that? So that's what I would suggest.
That makes sense. Let's talk a little bit about feedback. We did talk about feedback about the resume, but at this point, the candidate has invested time for the phone screen, for speaking with the recruiter, and potentially 4 hours with team members. Is it fair to expect feedback? Do companies provide feedback?
Well, it's fair to expect it. Companies, I think a lot of companies, to be honest, there are guidelines and what you can say and what you can't say and what things could make that company liable. So I think companies have kind of gotten scared by that. And therefore, instead of providing, actually like constructive feedback, instead they're kind of guided to just say thanks, but no thanks, or like it was great meeting you, but this isn't the greatest time, which can be super vague and obviously as a candidate, not very helpful. So I do think having, when you're using a recruiter, sometimes they can dig in and get you a little more feedback into something that you might, want to work on or improve so you can get that job next time. But overall, no, I don't, you really can't expect a lot of feedback, which I know is so unfortunate, but unfortunately it's kind of just the way things work with how the speed and demand and everything that's going on. Companies tend to just be so distracted by that they don't take the time to provide a feedback. And unfortunately, it burns that bridge, right? I mean, you do an interview, you spend 5 hours of your time with a certain company and you don't get the job, you're never going to want to interview at that company again. And you might have been a great fit. You were just maybe a year or two too junior or missing a certain tool of experience. So I think just being cognizant that you're probably not going to get a lot of feedback. So just continuing to ask for that. Make yourself as transparent as possible with the hiring manager, with the recruiter of, I just love feedback to make myself a better potential candidate. So that would be my suggestion. But unfortunately, no, I would say you probably shouldn't expect a lot of feedback aside from yes or no or maybe.
If you were still interested after a few months, do companies allow that? Like, do they, is there a time frame that you can reapply or be reconsidered?
Yes, I think usually on their job board or where you're applying, will instruct, have you applied to this job before? Have you applied to this company before? I would say, depending on how big that company is, continuing to apply to them and interview even a week or two from the time you interviewed. I think that's acceptable if it's a big company and there's different departments. If it's a smaller company, once you've interviewed, you're probably going to be waiting at least 3 to 6 months before you reapply to a job they have or something like that, because you've already met their stakeholders. They decided to pass. They're going to keep your resume on file. So if they have a job that comes up that fits you, they'll reach out. But from that point, with a smaller company, you kind of want to lay off the gas a bit on your applying to jobs and trying to interview there again.
Let's switch gears and now look at it from the viewpoint of the company and the startup in this more specifically. So, just to begin, how does a startup compete with the big three or the big four, but Amazon, Google, Facebook?
Yes, it's a trillion-dollar question, I think, because big tech and Amazon, Google, Facebook, the FANG companies they set the tone in a lot of ways of what someone should be paid, what kind of benefits they should get, but they also have the most resources so they can offer those things. So how do you compete with that as a smaller company when you can't offer $3 trillion base salaries or giant stock option plans? So, speed and telling a story is a big part of attracting certain talent to win over that. Now, the bureaucracy of a Google, Amazon, you're going to likely be interviewing for a month, if not longer, because there's so many different stakeholders. So as a smaller company, well, I always say be as efficient and as relatively quick as possible. You want to build momentum with that candidate. You want to tell them your story. You want them to buy into what you're trying to achieve, and that it's you against, your company against the big tech. Like, do you want to go join the big tech and get a lot of money and you're just going to be a cog in the wheel? Or would you like to be a part of something that's trying to disrupt or trying to improve or trying to change things? So I think that telling that story, building that mission, but also limiting your interview process, make it as efficient as possible for the candidate so that they aren't interviewing with you and then you don't talk to them for a week or two. Like, you want to build on that momentum. Those are ways you can compete with the big tech. The other way is offering stock options and offering equity in the company. That's obviously one way that you can get candidates to, see that, hey, if we end up getting bought or we end up IPOing at some point, you can make a lot of money. It's a big if, but it's a possibility. And then the third step is just career mobility, or career trajectory, career upward mobility. If you're a product manager or a software engineer, it might be nice to work at Google for a couple years, but after a year or two, you might want more responsibility. You might want to be coding things that are going to have more eyes or going to be a little outside of just the little microcosm, little app that you've been working on for 2 years as one of thousands of software engineers at Google. You can go to a smaller company and you're running the show. You're making decisions on how that product is going to look, how it's going to function, new technologies you can use to maybe make it more effective. So that's the other kind of part of, I would say, competing is sharing with a candidate. If these things are of interest to you, you'd have the opportunity at our company to do that. So I'd say those are probably the three areas that you have to capitalize on as a smaller company if you want to compete.
How do companies estimate the time investment per hire? Because that certainly is important with all the work that's going on at startups.
Yes. How do they estimate? I think in the job market we're in right now, it can take, if you're hiring for a software developer, 5 years experience, let's say, it's going to take anywhere from 1 to 3 months, if not longer, to fill that position. So a lot of a lot of companies that are startups, you gotta be ahead of the curve as far as posting that job, getting that job out to people in your network to share it with their networks, starting to interview candidates. But if you start interviewing and you find someone that you really like, you got to move fast. And as a candidate, like you want to be as accommodating as possible. But if it's an opportunity you really like and you care about, then looking at how can you make yourself most available around that company to meet with all the different people that need to speak with you. But I would say it's very hard to put a timeline on it because the demand is so high that it often takes at least a month, if not 3 or 4 months, to fill a software engineering or product position.
Earlier, you had mentioned the first thing the recruiter does obviously is building the talent pool, and screening resumes is a key part of that. Is AI used more and more in that area?
100%. AI is probably the most disruptive, not just in tech, but recruiting is certainly just seeing more and more of how you can utilize AI, machine learning to better prospect, find candidates or vet them out. The only fear for me, and I'm biased because I work at a smaller boutique type recruiting firm, but is you can create intelligence in an application. It's hard or maybe impossible to create the consciousness. So understand, reading between the lines of a resume and seeing maybe that they put themselves through college and that they've worked 3 jobs through college to get there. I think those are some of the intangibles that sometimes you miss. If I don't have Java all over my resume, I might miss out if that algorithm is calculating, a minimum of mentioning Java for 5 times on my resume, for example. It doesn't mean I'm not as good of a Java developer as the rest of the candidates that applied, but that's something to be aware of. So I think AI certainly will continue to disrupt recruiting in different ways. But as a candidate, you're looking at those keywords because, a lot of AI is taking into account those types of things or keywords, different experiences that you list on your resume or your application. So I wouldn't overdo it. It's a fine line between having Java on your resume 300 times versus having it on there 3 times. So I would say the best thing you can do is just continue to be efficient in how you write your resume, how you write your LinkedIn page, but certainly mentioning what tech stacks you work in at each job that you've been at. Don't list 100 technologies. Try to be relatively concise on the areas that you feel most like are your greatest strengths.
Besides that, what are the other tools that the recruiter would use?
Yes, they're going to use a lot of LinkedIn Recruiter. They might even be able to use GitHub as a way to find talent. Sometimes there's local job boards. In Austin, Texas, there's a thing called Built in Austin. I think they have Built in Chicago and a bunch of other cities where they have job boards that you can apply to. So I think those are tools that recruiters are using to identify, reach out, and engage with talent. So you just want to, if you're a candidate looking for a role, you just want to make yourself as visible as possible.
You had initially talked about the recruiters building a relationship with candidates. What about the recruiter's relationship with the hiring manager?
Yes, there is no like concrete universal answer. As you speak to recruiters, you'll start to get a feel for which one of them have a really good relationship directly with the hiring manager and which one of them might be new or might be like kind of still figuring things out and may not have that type of long-standing relationship with that company. I would say, again, if you can look on LinkedIn and look at that recruiter's background, you can kind of get a feel for like, wow, they've been recruiting for 10 years or they've been recruiting for this one company for a long time. Like they probably have very good relationships. Where if it's someone newer, you want to be a little more cognizant, skeptical of what they can do for you. But that doesn't, in some ways, the newer, less experienced recruiter might have more tenacity in getting your info reviewed, getting you feedback. So I don't think there's a right or wrong answer, but the recruiters, that's a constant struggle of theirs is to get feedback, get on the same page as the hiring manager and vice versa. Because the hiring manager knows that recruiter can't code in Java or do any microservice architecture, but they're the top of the funnel when it comes to recruiting. So if the hiring manager invests time with that recruiter, it's going to help both sides. But sometimes there's not a great relationship there, which can just makes it a very ineffective overall process or inefficient.
How many positions can one recruiter work on at the same time and still be effective?
Yes, I would say 3 to 5 positions would be ideal. And now, if you're doing technical recruiting, so you're just looking for software engineers, then maybe someone can cover front end, 3 front end roles, 3 back end roles, 3 DevOps roles, because obviously they're already running searches for software engineers that might lean front end, might lean back end, might lean infrastructure. So I think for a technical recruiter, they can often cover 3 to 5 efficiently. If it's all different skill sets, it's probably going to be closer to 3 or 4. So that would be, my instruction to companies that have recruiters is if you really want to get the most out of them, and you have to in this market to get tech, you get engineering talent. You can't be trying to cover 20 different roles and just doing an average job at all 20. You want to focus on 3 where you can do an incredible job, give an incredible kind of candidate experience, and get them through, the interview process and be on top of feedback and all that kind of stuff.
Talking about doing a great job at that, it starts with a job posting. Do people invest time in writing a good job posting?
Yeah, I don't know if there's a perfect way to write them. You'll probably see some if you're ever search for a job of we're looking for this unicorn that has every experience ever, and there's others that are very dull and kind of straight to the point. I think I always suggest that you read some articles just by Google. If you're a company, Google some of the best job descriptions, some of the most effective job descriptions on job postings on LinkedIn. I mean, LinkedIn provides articles on like you should use this kind of format to post your job. Indeed also does the same thing. So if you're posting your job, I think, do a little bit of research on what do candidates want to hear, but also thinking about the skill set you're hiring for. If you're hiring for a software engineer, you're probably going to want to talk in that job description early about fully remote work or what are the selling points, things that are major pain points for that talent pool. So that's what I would say is always before you write a job description, you don't have to be the best writer of all time. You can usually take a bunch of different job descriptions you find online and kind of bunch them into your own. But I would take a second and research, what makes a great job description. I could talk about it for an hour, which is why I suggest you go read about it because there are a lot of articles on how to do that.
So we talked about the interview loop a bunch earlier, so I won't go back to that. Once it's designed, how to make sure that the interviewers understand it, how to train them on executing the interview loop so that it's a pleasant experience.
Yes. Training your interviewers on how to not be repeatable across the entire like I think that either comes from the hiring manager and the executives of the company, or it comes from HR. We're not going to run 5 interviews just to ask the same 5 questions. So I think when you're prepping your interviewers, you're training your interviewers, you're letting them know that, we need to hire for this position. Here's the reason why. And then here are the question, here are some questions I'd like you to ask, but also, what are things you think you could ask? Yeah, in a market like this, when you're an interviewer, you kind of have to have your sales hat on every once in a while and share with that candidate why it's an attractive workplace. Like, why they should join you versus the 50 other companies that are reaching out to them. So I think, when you're training your interviewers, it's important for them to understand contextually why you're hiring. Because if they don't agree that you should be hiring, they're not going to give a good interview. In fact, they might scare away candidates. So helping them understand why you're hiring, things that are most important, ask for those interviewers' input because they know firsthand. And then having a feedback loop set up to where that interviewer is going to get, the HR person the feedback within 2 hours. Having that structure in place is critical if you want to acquire high in demand talent, because the feedback loop has to be fast. If it takes 2 weeks to get the next interview set up, you've lost that candidate. So I think training them on speed and efficiency is always the most critical part of training an interviewer.
And making sure that you understand the impact it's going to have to everything else the interviewer is doing to be able to be proactive and quick about the whole process.
100%. And transparency. Like candidates they don't want to hear 5 people telling them what they think they want to hear. If you're one of the interviewers, you can be like, hey, this part really sucks about this job. Or like, we're having a really hard time on back end development, but that's one of the reasons we're hiring for this role. So we're hoping you could be that person. Like, I think being transparent with your interviewers on why, what you really need out of the position, I think that's really important. And again, just making sure that not everybody's asking the same question. That's like the most common thing I feel like is then the candidates like, do these people even communicate with each other on like what my feedback was? I'm just answering the same question over and over. Like they don't sound like they have their stuff together. I don't want to work there. So you want to look professional. It's your, in a lot of ways, it's your demo. It's your demonstration of your company. So you want to have a good showing, even if the candidate doesn't decide to move forward.
So interview is done. People get together to evaluate. There's two levels of evaluation. One is fit, and then there is the level.
Yes.
How easy is that to do, especially the level?
Level is difficult, which is why you see like these coding tests of like, their coding test, they graded in this scale. So we're going to say that they're in this level. I don't know if that's fair. And you might lose candidates. You will lose candidates because of that, because they might have rushed that coding test or coding exam, or maybe they had 5 others that they were doing. So they only did half of it. That's why looking at a GitHub account, if you can get it from a candidate like that, that can usually be a better display. So I would say level is so difficult to evaluate, and there are tools you can use, but it just adds to the interview steps. And then that's not going to help you get talent because you're trying to be efficient and only do a couple steps. So I think we find a lot of companies will bring in, folks that were part of the technical interview and really kind of not just evaluate the coding challenge or not just evaluating their answers, but looking at their background and the companies they've worked for. What's the level of technical bar that they've worked at? Do references, look at their GitHub account before you make the decision of they're a staff level engineer or they're not a staff level engineer.
So it shouldn't be just about the interview. It's just about other things that go with it.
Exactly.
Obviously, this will play into the offer as well. So what role does a recruiter have in designing the offer?
The recruiter does not often get to really design the offer. Now, they can, more often than not, the recruiter is going to be the one that relays the offer from the hiring manager to the recruit. So they might have some flex, like the hiring manager might tell the recruiter, hey, we want to offer them 110K, but we're willing to flex this much, like see if you can get them to verbally accept. So the recruiter is the in-between that's trying to figure out how much the recruit wants, how much the hiring manager is willing to spend, and making a happy medium between the two. But I don't think the recruiter often has a lot of say in how that is crafted. They really will just provide context to the hiring manager of this is the comp range, the hourly rate they were seeking. They say that they're currently at 100K. Like, it's up to you, Mr. or Mrs. Hiring Manager, to decide what you want to offer.
Thank you, Chase. So I want to talk a little bit about recruiting events now.
Okay.
How are they different and how effective are they?
Recruiting events are, as I'm sure anyone that's listening that's been to one or hundreds, they are a dime a dozen in a lot of cases. There's a lot of them. They're not always the best audience or not always what you want or were hoping for. But, that kind of just comes with the territory of when you're trying to get people together in a group. I think there isn't a perfect way to run an event, but I do think, there is some credibility if a certain organization is running the event or if a certain speaker will be engaging there with people. I think paying attention to that and trying to see who else is going to that event, if you can, sometimes online you can see who's attending the event, and that can be a good way to determine if it's worth your time to go. But events are difficult to determine what is best, because it might end up being all recruiters. It might end up being all technical people and no recruiters. So it's just, you never know sometimes. And that's why I suggest just do your research before you go invest the time.
What about senior positions? What are the key differences when you're either hiring for a senior position or interviewing for a senior position?
Yes, for a senior role, I think you would like, as a recruit, as a interviewee, you would like to display a multifaceted skill set and or a very specific skill set. I think you want to tailor that around what the job is, because if a job is is specifically creating Docker containers and AWS, like, you want to be very specific about what you can do. But most, I think, senior level engineers, want to have a little more flexibility and creativity to work on some things. So from there, I think just describing in your interviewee process that you have worn different hats, you've tackled different challenges, tell the stories about what the challenge was. One of the interview questions asked is, what's the greatest challenge you've overcome? I think talking about those examples of when you stepped up as a senior engineer, as a lead engineer, and how you went about doing that is always a great demonstration of kind of, how a hiring manager judges a senior member of the team. Now, if you're hiring for that position, it can be just as difficult. because just because someone has 20 years experience does not mean they're a better engineer than the person that has 5 years experience. So I think you really want, sometimes for a senior role, you end up having to interview maybe a couple more times, or the interviewee might ask a couple more questions because it's just such an important position and a hard one to really nail down prior to making an offer.
Winding down now, my question to you is, how do you think things are going to change, let's say after a decade? What will be the change to the recruiting life cycle?
Well, hopefully I'm still around as a recruiter. Hopefully recruiters are still around. But I think a lot, obviously so much has been digitalized to where, a job board will look at your resume, the AI will look at your resume and start determining what job postings might be the best ones for you or what companies might be the best ones for you. So, and I think that's really cool. I think there are things that it might miss, but overall, I would say, 10 years or from now, I'd imagine a lot of this is digitalized, and hopefully some of it is rewarding the candidate. I mean, I feel like in so many cases, the company that it does the interviewing has so much leverage and or not just has the leverage, but I guess they can ask you and do as many interviews as they want. Hopefully it gets to the point where they're not that they're compensating recruits, but that they're getting the chance to give the recruits the same options to interview them. So I'm hoping that's something in the future, because it always depends on the job market. But 10 years from now, it wouldn't surprise me if a lot of this is all recordings and digitalized and there's no personal interaction. And that's my fear, but I think that might end up being more and more of the case, is you recording yourself answering certain questions and then submitting that to the hiring manager instead of actually talking to the hiring manager. I think that's certainly where a lot of things have progressed to be more efficient, and using AI to evaluate your answers and then determine if the hiring manager should actually look at your info.
That brings me to the question, what are you excited about in this whole life cycle? Like, as a recruiter, what is it that you love and what is it that keeps you up at night?
I think I love that I'm not a software engineer. I'm not I can do a little code here and there, but I'm no software engineer, but I get to talk every day to some of the best engineers and data engineers, technical talent in the world, in my opinion. So I think as a recruiter, it's so cool to get to be able to speak with people that maybe you normally wouldn't work with every day. And technology is clearly the future, and doing your best to understand that and position your recruits to be happy and get a job that checks the boxes of what they want, whether it be money, whether it be a more balanced lifestyle, whether it be they have to pay tuition for their kids to go to college, so they need a 20K bump in pay. Like, how can I, as a recruiter, help facilitate that in between the two? So I would say that's the most exciting part I have, is just continuing to get to work with a talent pool and, tech and product that's changing the world, and maybe more drastically than any talent pool ever has. So I think that's really what keeps me excited, is the constant changes and disruption that occurs in tech. It can be scary sometimes, but overall it's just incredible to be a part of it and get to help in any way that I can with people that are so smart and influential in what the world looks like. I think my greatest fear, the thing that keeps me up at night is certainly, that I think that supply and demand of talent, and being able to continue to find people and get them connected to the right types of jobs. I think there's so many, like in this market, that it's so wild to try to get someone through an interview process because they have 10 other companies reaching out to them. How do I get a hold of them? How do I make a good enough impression with that recruit that they want to work with me, that they'll let me know if they take another offer? A lot of ghosting occurs in recruiting, where from both sides, where the recruiter might ghost the candidate after they fail an interview, or the recruit might ghost them once they get another offer. And so it's just, it's hard to feel confident in every step. So I would say that's what keeps me up at night, is not, getting those relationships built, and trust and transparency.
Anything we missed that you would like to cover?
I don't think so. This has been outstanding. I think there's one topic we discussed offline was just the great resignation. A lot of folks, because of COVID, during COVID, such a major part was job security and ensuring that you had benefits and things like that to cover yourself and your family. And now, we're seeing 4 million people in July resigned, 4.5 resigned in August. And most of this is occurring in the tech and healthcare industry. So, in tech, it's definitely the demand. And even in healthcare, there's enough tech in healthcare now that, the demand is growing so substantially in industries that normally maybe wouldn't even have dealt with technology very much, like healthcare. So I think it's an exciting time for tech. And I think with all these resignations going on, there's a lot of people taking new jobs. It's just something to be aware of, that there's a lot of, if you're a recruit, there are a lot of recruits out there right now, but there are also a lot of jobs. So I think it's just a wild time to be in the recruiting, to be looking for a job or trying to hire right now, but a lot of opportunity.
How can people contact you?
Yes, LinkedIn, if I haven't said that enough. I swear LinkedIn should be paying me for my endorsements of them. But LinkedIn, Chase Kocher, or Kocher is how I pronounce it, but you can say Kocher. It's Kocher. If you want to look me up there, or at aimforhire.com, those are both good ways to get in touch with me. And then my email is chase@aimforhire.com. So it's pretty straightforward.
We'll put that in the show notes as well.
Yes.
It was so great having you on today, Chase. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you.
Thanks all for listening. This is Kanchan Shringi for Software Engineering Radio.
Thanks for listening to SE Radio, an educational program brought to you by IEEE Software Magazine. For more about the podcast, including other episodes, visit our website at se-radio.net. To provide feedback, you can comment on each episode on the website or reach us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, or through our Slack channel at seradio.slack.com. You can also email us at team@se-radio.net. This and all other episodes of SE Radio is licensed under Creative Commons License 2.5. Thanks for listening.